Finally, I've freed myself from this heavy burden. Starting today, my parents are moving in with me, into my home, and now my life is taking a new turn. But everything changed much earlier, when my parents passed away, and that tragic moment became a turning point in my destiny. That's when my husband, Scott, acted strangely and unexpectedly. On that day, without hesitation, he demolished our family home, and I watched his actions in disbelief. At one point, he threw a phrase at me that left me frozen in place: "Hurry and take the inheritance where it belongs." I stood there in shock, not understanding what he meant. In confusion, I asked, "What are you talking about? Have you lost your mind?" His words made me laugh involuntarily, though deep down, I still couldn't grasp the meaning of what was happening. Scott and my husband's relatives stared at me puzzled, their looks filled with confusion. And that's when I decided it was finally time to tell the truth. "My name is Amy Jackson," I began, feeling the words pour out on their own. "I was born into the family of a regular office worker, and I was the eldest daughter. I have a younger brother, and we grew up in a normal, loving family. When I turned 30, I married Scott, and we had 2 wonderful children. My husband and I tried to balance work and raising our kids, and life went on. Suddenly, I realized that I was already 52, and my son Eric and daughter Judy had grown up and started their own lives. They found their paths, built their careers, and now I thought it was time to relax and dedicate myself to a quiet, peaceful happiness with my husband. It was an ordinary life, but I loved it. I sincerely believed I would grow old just like that, in peace and quiet. But fate had other plans, and my simple life changed one winter day. My father, who had always been my rock, was in a car accident and suddenly passed away. He was only 68. Our whole family was plunged into deep grief, especially my mother. She was so devastated that she lost all interest in life. Every day, I begged her to eat, tried to cheer her up, but she only replied, "I just can't. It feels like something is stuck in my chest." My brother and I hoped she was just having a hard time coping with the loss, but soon it became clear her condition was worsening. My mother lost a lot of weight in 3 weeks, and worried, I took her to the hospital. The diagnosis the doctor gave was devastating: cancer, and already in a fairly advanced stage. Surgery wasn't an option, and the doctors gave her no more than a year to live. My soul was torn apart. I had barely begun to process the loss of my father when I learned that my mother was on the brink of death. My heart was breaking from the grief, but I knew I had to act. My brother lived far away and couldn't help, so all the care for my mother fell on me. I made the decision: I had to bring her to live with me. I had to be with her in her final days, to support her not only emotionally but physically as well. But Scott's reaction stunned me. He sighed irritably and said, "We just buried your father, and now I have to deal with your family's problems again." His words cut me to the core. "You don't have to say it like that," I said, trying not to let my emotions take over. "I just can't leave her alone. These are her last days, and I want to spend them with her." But Scott continued, "Can't you just visit her in the hospital? Why does she have to live with us?" I tried to explain that she might feel lonely, that it would be hard for her without our support, but Scott wouldn't stop. "And who's going to take care of me? Who's going to cook, clean, and take care of the house while you're living with her?" His words hung in the air, and I fell silent, not knowing how to respond. I intended to do everything in my power, but reality struck me hard. I realized that I couldn't handle things the way I used to. This realization was painful, especially if someone dared to call me selfish for wanting to care for my mother. And in truth, I wouldn't have been able to argue. My mother, with her kindness and attentiveness, would have undoubtedly said everything was fine, that I shouldn't torment myself, that life should go on as before. But I desperately wanted to do something for her, something to ease her last days. Scott seemed to have read my thoughts. He didn't share my eagerness, of course, but to my silence, he reluctantly agreed, saying, "Fine, but you know I can't help." His words sounded arrogant, cold, but I suppressed the urge to argue. Despite his attitude, I had to thank him for at least agreeing. In the end, it didn't matter what he thought. The important thing was that we moved into my parents' home, and now I could be with my mother. My gratitude was half sincere, half forced. But even in this complicated situation, I didn't want to stir up unnecessary conflict. Scott and I began a new life in my family's house. Before that, we lived in a home provided by his employer, which suited us just fine. Scott was an only child, and his father insisted that we live with them. But now our plans had changed. We never planned to buy our own home. We figured we'd eventually move in with his parents. Their home was convenient for work. The rent was relatively low, about $11,000 a month, which didn't seem like a huge burden. But when we moved into my parents' home, the need for rent disappeared, and we had more space for living. As promised, Scott didn't help with anything. But for me, it no longer mattered. The important thing was that I was with my mother. Despite her outward energy, the illness was taking its toll, and she spent a lot of time in bed. I cooked her meals, made sure she took her medication, and helped her with daily tasks. Every day, she grew weaker, and it would have been impossible for her to manage without my help. "I'm so sorry, Amy," she said to me in a quiet voice. "Thank you. You're doing more than I could ever ask for. And thank Scott for allowing you to be with me." Her words filled me with a bittersweet smile. Mom didn't know that Scott was far from thrilled about our living situation, that his words had been sharp and filled with irritation. She genuinely believed that, like me, he was doing everything possible to make her last days easier. Her gratitude was as sincere as her love. One evening, after Mom had fallen asleep and Scott returned from work, I brought up her treatment. While serving him dinner, I said, "Scott, we need to talk about Mom. Her condition is worsening, and I want to discuss treatment options." He looked at me coldly and said in a restrained voice, "I don't know what you expect to hear from me. I already told you I can't help." His words hit me like icy water piercing through my heart. All I wanted was for him to at least listen to me, to let me share my concerns. But his indifference was unbearable. Months went by, and Scott's attitude didn't change. He continued to complain about our living situation, as if he had done me a great favor by allowing us to move in with my mother. His irritation became more obvious with each passing day, but I couldn't say a word. Between caring for my sick mother and trying to keep our marriage intact, I felt myself losing strength. The tension was building. By the time 2 years had passed since her diagnosis, I was emotionally drained. My mother's condition worsened rapidly. And one day, she had to be hospitalized. She passed away 5 days later. Though I knew this moment would come, though I tried to prepare, her death was a heavy blow. Empty and broken, I stood by her bedside, trying to make sense of this farewell. My brother's family, my children, they all came and provided invaluable support during this difficult time. Their presence was an intangible comfort, but in moments like this, you most want your spouse by your side. However, Scott seemed to live in his own world. He laughed and chatted lightheartedly with his parents in the corner, as if the events didn't concern him. He didn't help with the arrangements or participate in the preparations for the funeral, as if he had distanced himself from our shared loss. My brother took charge of all the arrangements, and thanks to his efforts, we managed to get everything organized. When it came time for the ceremony, I faced another blow. Instead of sitting in the family section, Scott placed himself at the very back, among distant relatives. I approached him and quietly said, "Scott, I want you to sit in the family section." But he replied coldly, "No, I'm fine here. I'm not a blood relative." Those words pierced me like a knife. "But you're my husband," I added, trying to appeal to his emotions. Then his mother chimed in, "He's your husband, but not your mother's son. Scott is our son, and that makes him an outsider." Hearing those words, I was speechless. Everything inside me seemed to freeze. Where I come from, sons-in-law always sit in the family section at funerals, and their presence is seen as a sign of respect and support. But here, everything was different. Because Scott wasn't sitting with us, distant relatives started whispering. People began to wonder, had we separated? For some, it was just gossip, but for me, it felt like a thorn in my heart. This could all have been avoided if Scott had simply sat next to me. I felt bitterness and disappointment that he didn't support me at such an important moment, but I couldn't express my feelings to him. The funeral was over, and we returned to my parents' house. My brother's family, my kids, Scott, and his parents gathered around the table. I thanked everyone for being there, for their help and support during this difficult time, and offered them tea. My relatives laughed, saying, "Well, first your father, now your mother. These funerals have been a burden for all of us. But at least it's over now." Those words struck me. How could they say such things? I barely kept my composure, forcing myself to smile and apologize for the inconvenience. Inside, though, I was boiling. At that moment, I overheard Scott talking to his parents nearby. Yeah, it wasn't easy. Living with strangers turned out to be real torture. His mother quickly agreed, "Of course, Amy is too demanding. A husband shouldn't have to fulfill every whim of his wife. If you don't like something, you have the right to refuse." Scott's words burned me like hot coals. I clenched my fists, trying to hold back my anger. Their voices and laughter echoed through the room like slaps in the face. It was unbearable, yet sadly, not surprising. Scott's parents had always been insensitive. When we first got married, his mother once said, "You could have found someone better." His father once joked, "Can't expect much from the grandkids." He loved to tease, saying, "Beauty fades after 3 days, but with Amy, you'll never be bored." And Scott just laughed along, never standing up for me, never saying a word to stop them. It reflected his attitude toward me. At my father's funeral, just as now after my mother's death, Scott and his parents didn't offer me a single word of comfort. Instead, they mocked me for trying to do the right things for my family. I lived with a sense of guilt towards Scott, feeling that I was imposing my desires and burdens on him. But now I started to question, was that really right? I was increasingly wondering who he truly was. I realized that I shouldn't feel guilty towards Scott. For too long, I had let that guilt overshadow my own feelings, especially in light of his coldness and disregard. His parents' behavior during and after my mother's funeral felt unbearably cruel. They laughed and chatted in another room, as if nothing important was happening, as if my loss and pain didn't affect them at all. If my brother's family and my children had heard this careless and callous conversation, they would have been deeply upset. But fortunately, they were in the kitchen, and I was the only one who heard that offensive exchange. As I sat in silence, my mother-in-law approached me with an entirely unexpected question. "Amy," she called. I flinched, still under the impression of her earlier behavior, and replied, "Yes." In her hands was my mother's purse. She asked, with a slightly embarrassed smile, "Can I have it?" I felt the ground disappear from beneath me. "What?" I asked, not believing my ears. "Well, your mom doesn't need it anymore." Scott suggested I take it home. "Maybe I'll just keep it," she said calmly, as if it was some trivial thing, not a personal item of my recently deceased mother. I couldn't believe her audacity. This was happening right after the funeral. Unable to contain myself, I snatched the bag from her hands and firmly said, "No, you can't." My mother-in-law froze. Her face reflected not so much anger at losing the bag, but surprise that I, her daughter-in-law, had dared to stand up to her. But I was resolute. "We're not ready to go through my mother's things yet. We'll give them to family when the time is right," I added, holding back the trembling in my voice. At that moment, her face flushed with anger. "What are you trying to say? Are you calling me a stranger?" Her voice rang out in the room. "You yourself said at the funeral that even Scott was a stranger to my mother. So why do you now consider yourself part of our family?" I blurted out, unable to hold back. Those words hit their mark like searing arrows. Scott and his father, hearing this, turned red too, as if they had been caught in something shameful. Scott's father even tried to intervene. "How can you talk to your mother-in-law like that? Apologize immediately." This scene, unexpectedly unfolding before my eyes, drew everyone from the other rooms. All eyes were on me and my mother-in-law. "How could you call us outsiders after everything we did to attend the funeral?" she exclaimed with feigned indignation and glared at me defiantly. "Dad, let's go home," she shouted to her husband and, sobbing, ran out of our house. Scott was furious. He followed his parents without saying a word. A few minutes later, they drove off, leaving me in deep confusion and anger. When everyone gathered around the table again, I was bombarded with questions. What happened? Did you really call your mother-in-law a stranger? Some might think I had been too harsh, hearing the story from my mother-in-law's perspective. But when I calmly explained everything in context, no one judged me. My children, who had witnessed many unpleasant scenes with Scott's parents, simply nodded in understanding. "Grandma and Grandpa have always been like that," my son quietly said. And while my children showed maturity and understanding, I still couldn't forgive Scott and his parents for their heartless behavior. Scott didn't come home for a long time after that day. And though I didn't try to contact him, I felt that our silence couldn't go on forever. I wasn't sure if I could forgive him, even if he came with an apology. But one day, he did return. When he crossed the threshold, I greeted him with, "Welcome home," holding back the anger that flared inside me. In response, Scott said dryly, "It wasn't easy." His words sounded like an attempt to justify himself, and I was baffled by his attitude. Scott approached me, handing over some travel vouchers, and said, almost with forced warmth, "Take the kids and go on a trip. It'll be a great break for you." I was stunned. Instead of words, my eyes filled with tears, not from bitterness, but from unexpected emotion. Perhaps this idea had come from our children, and Scott, against his usual nature, supported them. I was touched by this gesture, even if it seemed out of character for him. Wasting no time, I immediately reached out to the kids to start planning the trip. Really, Dad suggested this? Unbelievable, Judy exclaimed when she heard the news. It was clear the kids hadn't expected such a turn of events. I guess he's really thought about what happened, I joked, laughing and feeling a lightness in my heart. Receiving the vouchers from his hands, I accepted the gift with gratitude. I'll be gone, but don't worry, Scott said, noticeably trying to show concern. Spend time with the kids, don't think about me. I'll stay with my parents. His offer seemed noble, yet at the same time, strangely distant, as if he was trying to lift some invisible burden from himself. Before leaving for the spa, I decided to visit my friends, Judy and Gary. I hadn't had time to check in on them while I was caring for my mom. I decided to cook for them, to freeze meals and leave them for the future. Mom, you need to relax yourself, Judy remarked with a smile, though she was grateful for the help. I felt that cooking and helping them was a kind of therapy for me, a way to regain some control over my life. All of this was made possible by Scott's unexpected suggestion. Finally, the long-awaited day of the spa trip arrived. Together with the kids, I spent days in Warm Springs, relaxing and finally allowing myself to forget the recent trials. The care, exhaustion, and the bitterness of loss that had weighed on me in recent months seemed to fade, leaving only lightness and peace. The time spent with my kids healed me, if only for a short while. We stayed away for almost a week, and when the kids returned to their homes, their faces were glowing with joy. It was wonderful. We have to thank Dad, they said with sincere smiles. Of course, I replied, happy to see them so content. But Judy, half joking, added, I wonder if he's up to something. Don't say that, I laughed. Dad just wanted to take care of us in his own way. As I headed home, I imagined how Scott and I could sit down and talk, share memories from the trip, and perhaps even start over as a couple. But what I saw stopped me in my tracks, leaving me in shock. The house, it was gone. I recognized the spot where it once stood, but now, where our family home should have been, there was only empty space. My heart sank, and my breath quickened. Out of nowhere, Scott appeared, followed by his parents. They stood there with smug smiles, as if they had just achieved something monumental, something triumphant. Scott, what is going on? I asked, trying to keep my composure. With that same awful grin, Scott finally replied, I've finally rid myself of that burden. Starting today, my parents are moving in here. This is our home now. His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. What are you talking about? I barely managed to keep the tremor out of my voice, still clinging to the hope that this was some horrible dream. Have you lost your mind? This house belonged to my family. What have you done? Without a hint of remorse, Scott continued, your family home has been demolished. Now, the only thing left is the inheritance, and that will be ours. Whatever you inherited, it now belongs to me. In that moment, everything became clear. The demolition of the house, the invitation to the trip, it had all been part of his plan. He had betrayed me, destroying not only our home but the last remnants of my connection to the past. Rage and despair overwhelmed me. Standing there before Scott and his smirking parents, I felt something unexpected rising inside me. Instead of tears, I began to laugh. The laughter poured out from deep within, not from joy but from the pain and absurdity of being betrayed so thoroughly. The smiles on Scott's and his father's faces quickly faded, replaced with confusion. "Why are you laughing?" Scott's voice wavered. My mother-in-law looked at me with disdain, her expression one of disgust, as though I had lost my mind. "She's gone mad," she said coldly, her gaze treating me like something foreign and dangerous, disturbing their peace. But I no longer feared their looks or their words. Instead, a strange, bitter laughter welled up inside me, desperate to escape. "You seem to have no idea what you're talking about," I said, unable to stop myself from another burst of laughter. "The inheritance? I didn't get a single penny. Your dreams of wealth are nothing but the product of your wild imagination." Their faces contorted with disbelief, then unease. They looked at me, unable to understand what had triggered my laughter. Frowning, Scott demanded, "What do you mean? Explain yourselves." But I said nothing, seeing no point in cluing them into what I had known all along. In that moment, they seemed like strangers, people I wanted nothing more to do with. "If you want to live with them," I said, addressing Scott, ignoring his question and looking him straight in the eyes, "go ahead. But I won't be in this house anymore." My words, my cold detachment, enraged my mother-in-law. Her face flushed red, her eyes sparkled with indignation. "You took care of your parents, you helped them, but when it came to us, you refused. Do you even understand the situation we're all in? You were supposed to agree to live with us," she nearly screamed, trying to justify her actions and place all the family's problems squarely on my shoulders. "I never agreed to this," I snapped back, cutting her off. "I didn't want to live with you, much less be your housekeeper. And don't forget that you only agreed to it to avoid your own responsibilities. And demolishing the house like that. There are some things you just can't do." Those last words pushed me over the edge. I felt the fury and despair tearing me apart from within. I couldn't stay in that house any longer, couldn't stand to see their faces, couldn't breathe the same air. Turning on my heel, I stormed out, ignoring their shouts and questions. They yelled after me, but I didn't look back. All I knew was that I needed to leave, to find a place to stay as quickly as possible, and not see Scott or his parents for at least the next few days. I contacted a lawyer immediately, feeling that I could no longer leave this nightmare without consequences. Demolishing a house isn't as simple as they thought. The house was still in my mother's name, and I was curious about which company had taken on the task. The truth turned out to be even more horrifying. Scott and his father had torn down the house themselves. His father worked in construction, and using his connections, he enlisted acquaintances and even rented heavy machinery to get the job done. It was all meticulously planned, every step calculated. Even my trip with the kids, the travel vouchers, it had all been a trap, a way to distract me, to get me out of the way so they could carry out their plan unhindered. When I realized the full scope of the deceit, tears welled up in my eyes once more. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a feeling of betrayal, a deep, unbearable pain. I looked at my lawyer, and he, noticing my gaze, smiled warmly and said, "Scott unlawfully demolished the house that belonged to your mother. This qualifies as property destruction, and he will be required to compensate for the damage. Let's start by officially demanding an apology." I nodded, feeling my anger slowly give way to resolve. A few days later, Scott called me, furious. I heard his voice, filled with outrage and irritation. "What is this letter I received?" he shouted down the phone. His voice trembled with anger, but it no longer affected me. "It's a legal notice," I calmly replied. "You destroyed my house, so of course, you'll have to compensate for it." "Compensate?" Scott yelled. "We agreed that my parents would move in with us. The house was empty, no one was living in it, and you should be grateful that I got rid of that old wreck. Now, return the inheritance and come home." My patience snapped. "Grateful for demolishing my house? Don't make me laugh, Scott. The inheritance hasn't even been settled, and you have no right to demand anything." My words came out strong, like a thunderclap, and in that moment, I realized I could never look at this man the same way again. Scott fell silent, his face seeming bewildered, as though he didn't even understand where his anger had come from. It was almost strange to see him like that, since he usually tried to maintain a cold and detached demeanor, as if nothing could rattle him. And it was this very bewilderment that stirred in me another wave of bitter laughter, one I could no longer hold back. The reason for my laughter lay in the fact that Scott, of course, had no idea that the inheritance he was so fixated on didn't exist in the way he imagined. A whole year had passed since my mother and I had discussed the inheritance. She knew I didn't want any money, that I didn't need shares or savings. The entire estate, by my decision, had gone to my brother. He, in turn, insisted that the house should remain with me. He lived far away and wouldn't be able to manage it. We agreed that if I didn't want to live there, we could rent it out so it wouldn't sit empty. That was our simple plan, nothing more, nothing less. Now, standing before Scott, I looked at him as if he were a complete stranger. "Either you and your father rebuild the house in its original condition, or you pay the amount stated in the notice," I said firmly. My words pierced the space between us like a cold wind. "I was willing to settle this peacefully, but if you don't comply, I will file a lawsuit. Believe me, Scott, this time I won't back down." He tried to protest, but I just stood there, waiting. "I'm really sorry. I didn't think you'd get so angry," Scott began to explain, his voice full of confusion. "Of course, I'm angry. What did you expect, Scott?" I thought. But out loud, I merely said, "Of course I'm angry, and you know that perfectly well." It seemed Scott hoped that by demolishing the house, he would somehow magically escape the need to live with his parents. He had always thought his father was obsessed with the idea of them all living together and that their entire life would revolve around their family home. When Scott mentioned his parents, I suddenly realized just how deeply they had entangled themselves in their illusions. His father had always dreamed that we would all live together. He adored his son and thought we, as a new family, would move in with them. Scott, for his part, resisted the idea, citing how inconvenient it would be to commute to work from his parents' home. Yet, in the end, he decided the best way to solve the problem was to convince everyone that I had been the one to refuse. Demolishing the house was his last move. He hoped that by doing so, I would be forced to move in with his parents and hand over the entire inheritance. But after all that had happened, I couldn't forgive him anymore. "Please, give me a break," Scott sighed wearily, as if he had just realized that he had gone too far. "I didn't mean to hurt you. My dad regrets it too." "If you're truly sorry, then agree to my terms," I replied sharply, ending the conversation and hanging up. Scott continued to call and message me for the next few days, his apologies full of desperation. But now, Every word he said felt empty to me. Sorry? I thought. If you're truly sorry, just transfer the money. I knew the home of my childhood could never be restored. All that was left were ruins of the past, but inside, I knew there was only one path left for me, to fight until the end. I stayed at my friend Judy's house. It became my temporary refuge. My brother and my children knew everything that had happened. I couldn't hide this pain from them, but I didn't want to drag them into the conflict either. My brother, though furious that the house was demolished without his consent, showed great dignity. I won't interfere, he said. But I'll help however I can. Just tell me what you want to do, Amy. My small circle of support stood by me, condemning Scott's actions. A month passed, but there was neither payment nor compensation from Scott. During this time, he kept trying to contact me, but I didn't respond. I couldn't stay at Judy's forever, and I needed the money as soon as possible to start my life anew. However, something unbelievable happened instead. One evening, while Judy and I sat across from each other, she glanced at her phone and suddenly exclaimed, "This apron looks just like Grandma's." Puzzled, I looked at her screen and was stunned. It was an apron almost identical to the one I had made for my mother by hand. It was a unique piece, and I was certain it had been lost. How is this possible? That's the same apron I made for Grandma. I cried out. Judy quickly started scrolling through other listings from the seller. The account had been created recently, with no reviews or transactions. The listings on the app seemed to tear my soul apart. Familiar items appeared on my screen one after the other: my mother's old jewelry boxes, porcelain figurines, her favorite dresses, and even those rare family heirlooms that had always been cherished with special care. My heart sank as I realized that all of these belonged to my mother, now up for sale. About 50 items, each one a part of her life. The oppressive sense of helplessness I'd felt since the house was demolished returned with full force. Only one person could have done this: Scott. He had access to the things after the house was destroyed, and no one else could have obtained them. I immediately called him, my voice filled with anger and pain. "What's this app, Scott?" I demanded. On the other end of the line, I heard a frustrated hissing sound. Clearly, he was in a bad mood. "What are you talking about?" "What app?" he replied, irritated, as if my question was distracting him from something more important. I wasn't about to play his games and went straight to the point. "Don't play dumb. You're selling my mother's things, aren't you? Cancel all the listings immediately." My voice grew firmer, and I could hear the threat in it. Scott panicked. I could hear the worry in his response. "No, it's not me. I don't know who did it. But who else could have thought of selling the family's heirlooms?" Everything pointed to him. "I'm coming over right now to get everything back," I said coldly, hanging up without waiting for more of his excuses. I called for Judy, and we headed to his parents' house. As we arrived at their home, I was shaking with anger. I approached the door, barely able to restrain myself from pounding too hard. Scott opened it, and upon seeing me, froze in tension. "Where are my mother's things?" I demanded sharply, unwilling to waste time on pleasantries. He stammered, clearly trying to come up with an excuse. I don't know anything about that." My conviction only strengthened upon hearing his unconvincing words. "Tell the truth, Scott," I demanded. Judy, standing next to me, supported me with her determined stare. He was visibly nervous, unsure of what to do. Before Scott could respond, his parents noticed our presence. Scott's mother came out onto the porch, saw us, and, maintaining her friendly demeanor, exclaimed, "Oh, Judy, how wonderful to see you." Her smile seemed entirely out of place given the circumstances. But Judy wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "Grandma, tell Dad to tell the truth," she said sharply, addressing her grandmother. Scott's mother looked completely unfazed. She laughed as if the whole situation didn't matter at all. "Scott? Oh no, it couldn't be him. I sold all of that myself," she declared suddenly, and for a moment, my blood froze. Her words hit me like a blow to the heart. I saw Scott shrink at her words, as if caught in the act. He looked at her as if he knew this was wrong, but was powerless to stop it. Unbothered by Scott's distressed look, his mother continued to speak as if nothing was amiss. "Oh, it's so much work, you know. Packing everything up, taking nice photos. But it turned out to be a fun hobby. Now I have something to keep me busy and I can make a little pocket money," she said cheerfully, as if she were talking about a new, exciting pastime, completely unaware that she was selling stolen family treasures she had no right to. I struggled not to lose control. The rage building inside me was becoming harder to manage. Judy, seeing her grandmother's lack of remorse, started to plead through her tears, "Grandma, please stop this. Those things belong to my grandma. You can't sell them." But Scott's mother merely frowned, as if annoyed that anyone would ask her to stop something so trivial. "What's the big deal? I finally found a hobby I like. I enjoy going through all those old things. It's good for preventing dementia, and the money always helps. Judy, you want me to stay healthy and live a long life, don't you?" she said almost nonchalantly, with no trace of remorse. I realized then that talking to her was useless. I took a deep breath and turned to Judy, saying, "Let's go. We need to take action." I insisted we leave, feeling that if I stayed any longer, I might lose control completely. We drove straight to the police station. Now I had no doubts left. If I had hesitated about filing a complaint over the demolition of the house, the theft of my mother's belongings was the final straw. When I explained the situation to the police, they acted immediately. Scott's mother's account on the app was blocked, and all the items were taken down from sale. I was walking back from the station when I decided to call Scott, realizing that our relationship was irreparably falling apart. His voice sounded irritated, but before he could say anything, I coldly cut him off. "I've blocked your mother's account. You knew about it, didn't you? You're an accomplice." Silence on the other end, just for a moment, and then Scott exploded, "We're family. How can you do this? Call it off, I'm begging you." There was no remorse in his voice, only anger and self-righteousness. "Family?" I repeated, barely containing my disdain. "What about the compensation for the house? The child support? All this time, you haven't shown an ounce of remorse. And now that I'm demanding justice, suddenly we're family." My words cut him like knives, and I could hear Scott reeling from my anger. Yes, despite everything, I still had feelings for this man. We had spent years together, and no matter how much I tried to suppress it, a part of me still hoped for a peaceful resolution. I sighed, trying to calm myself down. "I'll wait for the money, but I won't forgive the theft. Return everything. And by the way, your father, he looks very unwell." Has he seen a doctor? I'm not a monster, Scott. Just take this as a warning, I said, and hung up the phone. Scott's father, whom I had seen just moments ago, looked terrifyingly frail. His face wasn't just pale, it had taken on a sickly, almost grayish hue. He was too thin, as if life was draining from him day by day. When I met him, I could tell his health was on the brink of disaster, but his family seemed oblivious to it. His wife continued her carefree dealings with the stolen goods, and Scott treated me like an enemy, without a hint of sympathy or concern. Was there even a shred of humanity left in this family? The next day, I received a call. When I saw the number, I thought it might be Scott or perhaps his mother with some kind of apology, but it was Scott's father on the other end. I was surprised, as he had looked so frail the day before, but his voice sounded unexpectedly firm, almost aggressive. "What do you think you're doing?" he began, not giving me a chance to respond. "You think I'm sick? You think you can just send me off to the hospital and get rid of the burden?" He spoke with such anger, as if I had planned to betray him. "It's my duty to protect Scott and my wife from you, understand? I'm not going to die or go to the hospital." His voice trembled, but it wasn't from weakness, it was from fury. I was stunned. All my attempts to show concern had been taken as a threat. "I'm sorry if I crossed a line," I began to apologize, even though deep down I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. "I was just worried." But his tirade continued. "I'm not as weak and short-lived as your parents. Don't treat me like a fool." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. My parents, but I held myself together, deciding it wasn't worth continuing this pointless argument. A few days later, the news came, though I had already expected it. Scott's father was admitted to the hospital. His diagnosis was relentless: terminal cancer. Scott called me in a panic, unsure of what to do. "Amy, Dad has cancer, it's terminal. What should I do?" Scott's voice was filled with despair, but I couldn't respond with the warmth he might have expected. "I don't know, Scott," I said flatly. When he mentioned, I suggested he go to the hospital, but he said he wasn't weak or short-lived like your parents. I felt my emotions twist into a cold knot. "Handle it yourself," I managed to say, not wanting to speak further. Scott exploded. "How can you be so heartless, Amy? I never thought you'd be this kind of person." But I couldn't hold back the sarcasm in my reply. "Did you ever say a single kind word when my mother was dying? Think about your own actions." Time flew by, and as expected, Scott's father soon passed away. I couldn't bring myself to hate him. After all, he was just a man suffering from the inevitable. But I didn't shed a tear for him either. After the funeral, the formalities began, something no one was eagerly awaiting: the reading of the will. As it turned out, despite all his talk of longevity and disdain for weakness, he had carefully planned his final steps. The house was bequeathed to his grandson, Eric, while the rest of the estate was divided between his wife and elder son. When I heard Eric's name, I was surprised, but then I remembered how Scott's father had always favored him. He dreamed of Eric living with him, and likely wanted the house to remain with his grandson after his death. For Eric, the inheritance, especially the house, wasn't as joyful an event as one might think. It became more of a burden than a benefit, as the inheritance tax turned out to be quite expensive. Yet, despite this, he didn't show any regret. I understood that my words had no right to influence his decision. The will was carried out by law, and the house went to him. His grandmother was also pleased with the outcome, perhaps because she helped Eric pay the tax. She had always considered him her successor, and though I felt a twinge of sadness that it seemed like Eric had been taken from me, I couldn't deny that this was simply the way things were. In the meantime, something unexpected happened. This event marked the beginning of a series of changes that would forever alter our lives. I was at home when I received a call from Scott. He was so agitated that I immediately went to his parents' house. When I arrived, I couldn't believe my eyes. Scott and his mother stood outside, both shocked and bewildered. Their expressions mirrored the confusion I had once felt myself. In front of them were heavy machinery and trucks belonging to construction companies, and workers were already in the process of demolishing their home. Their family home was literally falling apart before their eyes. "What's happening here?" Scott exclaimed, trying to comprehend the situation. "It's my house, and I can do whatever I want with it," Eric calmly replied, appearing suddenly with a satisfied look on his face. He stood there, watching the demolition with a cold, almost vindictive smile on his lips. "Eric, what are you doing? Stop this immediately!" Scott shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But Eric remained unmoved. "Even if you stop it now, the house is already uninhabitable," he replied indifferently. Scott's mother and Scott began pleading with Eric to stop what was happening. But instead of sympathy, they were met with cold laughter. "Did you forget what Grandpa and Dad did to Mom? Grandma, you did awful things to her too. Did you ever apologize?" Eric's voice was filled with long-held resentment. His smile faded, replaced by a hard, icy glare, and Scott and his mother collapsed helplessly to their knees before the heavy machinery that was relentlessly tearing down their past. The sound of crumbling walls merged with muffled sobs, but I stood aside, finally feeling a sense of relief that this chapter, filled with pain and loss, had finally come to an end. Later, a few months after, Scott finally paid off all his debts and compensations using the funds he inherited. The stolen belongings of my mother, which his mother had shamelessly claimed as her own, were returned by Eric. He personally handed them to me, and I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. "You'll always have me and Judy," Eric said, and this time I couldn't hold back the tears. These were tears of relief and, perhaps, a bit of bittersweetness that this long journey had come to a close. Scott and his mother, left without a home and nearly penniless, were forced to return to the house owned by the company where Scott once worked. It was a humiliation for them, as everyone knew why they had been forced to return there. Meanwhile, Judy and I had long left that house behind, and now Scott and his mother had to face harsh conditions, becoming the subject of gossip and ridicule among their colleagues. One day, I decided to share this whole story with the wife of one of Scott's colleagues, with whom I had maintained a good relationship. She found it hard to believe what that family had gone through, and although I felt pity for Scott and his mother, I understood that they had brought their lives to this point themselves. Perhaps after Scott's retirement, they would have to start saving for a new home, but that no longer concerned me. Sometimes I wonder how Scott and his mother are living now, but it's only out of idle curiosity. My life has changed, and these thoughts no longer trouble me as they once did. Time passed, and I stayed in Judy's home, where I finally felt safe. Eric soon got engaged and married, planning to build a new home for his family. The land where his ancestors' house once stood was sold for a substantial sum, and I was glad that even that house, filled with tragedies, found its purpose. My life seemed to have returned to normal. Mom moved in with us, and Eric offered that I stay with them. He was caring and kind, understanding that I could no longer rely on Judy, who lived alone. Accepting his offer, I found peace in my heart, resolving never to repeat my mother-in-law's mistakes.